Evening. How's everybody doing tonight? All right, I'm going to do it one more time, just make sure everybody's awake. How's everybody doing this evening? Excellent, so much better. On behalf of KPCC in LAist and our partners here at the National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, welcome to the Tadayuchi Democracy Forum for tonight's program. My name is John Cohn. I manage In Person, our live events and programming platform for KPCC and LAist. We do a range of things. I highly encourage you to check out our website to see what we're up to. They range from large-scale events to forums and town halls and community conversations like the one we're at tonight. Tonight's event is the second installment of our SoCal Solutions series. You should be seeing slides that have been cycling back and forth. And in this series, we've come to you, we turn to you to help us determine what we're going to talk about. So we sort of pick a broader topic, we open it up to the community for submissions of ideas, suggestions, we put it to a vote, and that's how we've ended up this evening focusing on transparency in law enforcement. And we have a really, really great panel lined up for this evening. Our next SoCal Solutions event will focus on healthcare, and we're currently in the voting round for that. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to vote in the lobby and let us know if we should focus on universal access, the cost of healthcare, or mental health services. And again, like I said, you can cast your vote out in the lobby afterwards. That event, make sure you RSVP, will be on June 19th, right here, same place, same time. And KPCC's Michelle Faust-Ragavan will moderate that program. So, quick housekeeping for today. As a news organization, we are audio recording and live video streaming. So you can use your devices, but please turn off your flash, maybe put them on silent. Photos are okay, but no flash and no audio or video recording. We have that covered. There will be a couple of opportunities to participate in tonight's program. We're going to go to the audience, so wait till a microphone comes to you, say your name, maybe where you live, and hold forth. I do like to remind people that questions end with question marks. After the event, we hope you'll stick around for a casual reception you all are invited to. But for now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming your host for the evening, KPCC correspondent Frank Stoltz.
Thank you, John, and thank you guys for showing up tonight, and welcome to our live stream audience. We have a great show, a great program on for tonight. We have some of the most knowledgeable people in and around law enforcement with us, and so it's going to be a great discussion at a moment in time that's very important in law enforcement. We are entering an era of transparency unlike anything we've seen in the past. And some folks are cheering that. Others are saying in law enforcement are a little worried, and we will get into all of that tonight. The topic tonight, transparency, actually came about through a new process we have at KPCC where we are interacting more with audiences, asking you what topics you think are important, and what questions you think are important and want answered. And so we polled our audiences online, over the air, about what in the area of criminal justice they wanted to explore. We narrowed that down to 3 topics. We had a voting process, and we ended up with the question of transparency, how transparency or the lack of transparency in the past may have fostered corruption in any way or bad policing, and how this new era of transparency that we're entering may help or hinder cops on the street and law enforcement agencies. I arrived in LA in 1991, 3 months before Rodney King was beaten. A year later, we had the worst riots in modern American history. And I thought, gee, this is quite a news town. There's a lot going on in policing in Southern California and Los Angeles. But I can tell you that in that first high-profile event that I experienced as a news reporter in Los Angeles, you know, beyond the video, there was very little information about that incident, about the officers, about the unfolding investigation. And I think one of the reasons it was such a huge event was that in the years and decades prior to that, the public got very little information about their law enforcement agencies. And really kind of for the first time, on video, there was this abuse of force that was there for everybody to see. And I think that's really why that event was so important. For the first time we could see it. California really has been behind other states in terms of releasing information about police departments, releasing information about investigations, about police officers. There's something called the Police Officer Bill of Rights that was passed in the 1970s that provided extraordinary protections for officers in terms of officers who were accused of wrongdoing, officers who were just involved in events, not even accused of wrongdoing, just an officer who used force. We didn't know their names. We didn't know who they were. We have, and then we entered a period, the digital age, where police departments were collecting more and more and more information, and yet we still did not have access to it. This occurred in the environment of a post-9/11, when there were lots of worries about terrorism, and police budgets for terrorism grew, and sort of an aura of secrecy around what local police departments did grew. And then we have the shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, of Michael Brown, and an explosion in this debate about policing in America. And I really think that, in some ways, was a turning point for policing. Now, some would argue that there's been a pile-on policing, that in the era since Ferguson, we've come to demonize police officers in an unfair way. We'll get into that. But there's no question what it's done is it has prompted a demand in the public for greater transparency. People want to know now, more than ever, what their police officers, what their police departments are doing on their behalf in their name. And what we're going to get into tonight is, what that means for cops on the street, what that means for people who interact with police, what that means for our perception of law enforcement. Because I've contended for a long time, particularly in this post-9/11 era, with Pew Research showing a decline in confidence in the American system, a decline in participation in civic organizations around the country, that people's confidence in their local police departments will be one critical thing to the survival of the democracy. And I don't think that's an overstatement. I think that how people feel about the men and women in uniform who uphold the law is critical to how the country moves forward. So if that isn't a big enough setting of the table, I don't think I can set it much bigger than that. This is a critical topic. Let's see, and obviously I'm kind of bearing the lead here. This comes in the context of the passage of legislation that took effect January 1st, Senate Bill 1421, which requires the release of more information, the release of more video under another piece of legislation, and we will get into all of that as well. We're going to start out with a video produced by the Los Angeles Police Department, and the LAPD actually has been a little bit out front on this one. They were really the first big city police department to equip all of its officers that are dealing directly with the public, 7,000 of them, with body cams, and had a requirement to turn those body cams on with just about every interaction with the public. Millions of hours of video and audio produced now by the LAPD. And LAPD was one of the first, if not the first, to make a decision at the really at the urging of its civilian. I can't say it was the men in uniform that pushed that policy. It was the 5-member civilian police commission that oversees the LAPD that mandated release of this video. So I'd like to say that the chief of police did it. It really wasn't the chief of police. It was the 5-member civilian police commission that said, hey, it is time to start releasing this video. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a sort of a pared down and edited down version of one of these videos that what I will describe was sort of the result of this push for the public in the post-Ferguson era, post-Ferguson shooting era, to see more of what its police department does. So this wasn't mandated. It is mandated now as a result of state legislation, but the LAPD started doing it before it was mandated. I will warn you, there may be elements of this video that could be disturbing. So if you're somebody who's particularly sensitive to violence, or if you're somebody who has a child with you, you're warned that this could include some sensitive material. But let's go ahead and play the video.
I'm Commander Alan Hamilton of the Force Investigation Group of the Los Angeles Police Department. I'm going to give you a brief overview of an incident that began on July 29, 2018 at around 10:03 p.m. Southwest officers were at the scene of a radio call, standing outside of their marked black and white police vehicle on 29th Street near Normandy Avenue, when a suspect discharged rounds from a moving vehicle and drove in the direction of the officers, resulting in an officer-involved shooting. You will see body-worn video of one of the involved officers. These are cameras that are assigned to nearly every officer working field duties. They're worn at chest level and provide a perspective from that angle.
The thing is that the baby is crying.
Approximately 10 minutes after the officer-involved shooting occurred, the registered owner of the vehicle involved in the shooting called 911 from several blocks away to report that she was the victim of a carjacking and had been kidnapped in her vehicle.
Did you see the person in your car?
It was Alikhan. He had tattoos on his face.
Yeah, what?
He had tattoos on his face. I just ran into Alikhan.
This investigation is ongoing, and every effort will be made to identify the suspect in this incident.
In the next several months, the LAPD will continue to investigate and analyze this incident as witnesses come forward and forensic tests are completed. After the investigation is completed, the Chief of Police will forward his findings to the Civilian Board of Police Commissioners, who will evaluate the evidence to determine whether the officer's tactics and uses of force met the high standards expected of all LAPD officers. If you'd like more information on how the LAPD and the LA District Attorney's Office investigates all officer-involved shootings and other serious uses of force, visit lapdonline.org, where you can also find LAPD's use of force policies and procedures.
So the last fella was the chief of public information for the LAPD, who happens to be a former weatherman in Los Angeles. That's why he looks so good on television. Let's go ahead and bring up our guests now. Fantastic group of folks who are extremely knowledgeable about policing in Los Angeles. So let's start with the number 2 man at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Tim Murakami, Under Sheriff Tim Murakami. Tim, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is the largest sheriff's agency in the country, and the undersheriff, in case you don't know, actually runs the day-to-day operations of this 9,000 plus sworn and plus 8,000 employees, and I need to say the agency that operates LA County jails with 16,000 jail inmates. Also with us today is the Constitutional Policing Advisor for the Los Angeles Police Department, Arif Alikhan. Arif. Arif has been a well-known figure in Los Angeles County law enforcement, having served as Deputy Mayor for Public Safety under Antonio Villaraigosa, also in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and also served for a time at the main U.S. Justice Department in Washington, D.C., as I believe as an advisor on anti-terrorism, were you not?
I was on cybercrime and intellectual property at the Department of Homeland Security.
Homeland Security.
Counterterrorism.
Also joining us is Ron Hernandez, who is the president of the Association for Los Angeles County Deputy Sheriffs. It is, I think, the largest police union in the state, and I'm going to dare say the most powerful police lobby in Sacramento. If you want to point to any organization and blame them or praise them for some of the laws around transparency over the last few decades, we'll hear more from Ron about that. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Right.
You're
Thank
also a 30-year rank and file deputy sheriff.
Yes, actually going on 35 years.
35 years. You don't look that old. Also with us is the Director of Police Practices, Peter Biebring. He is the Director of Police Practices for the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California, and so appropriately seated next to the head of the police union. And Kim McGill is one of perhaps the most knowledgeable activists, street activists in Los Angeles around issues regarding criminal justice and justice in general. She is a member, I call her the head of the Youth Justice Coalition, but I know the Youth Justice Coalition does not act much more as a collective and would never call herself as the head of it, but certainly one of the heart and souls of that organization. And you've been with that organization for 8 years?
Since it started, so yeah, almost 13 years.
A long time. And has been involved in helping shape policy at the county and at the city level in terms of justice issues. So we have a fantastic panel today, and what I'd like to do is go ahead and start with sort of the most current issue that people in and out of law enforcement are dealing with, and that is Senate Bill 1421, which is the bill that required agencies to open up previously secret documents involving anything having to do with officers who use deadly force, officers involved in sustained allegations of sexual misconduct on the job, or in sustained allegations of dishonesty on the job. The American Civil Liberties Union was one of the key backers of that and pushers of that law. So let's start with you, Peter, to kind of give us a primer on SB 1421.
Sure. And I should say Youth Justice Coalition was also one of the co-sponsors of that bill, along with a broad coalition of community and civil rights organizations. But yeah, I mean, I think the place to start is prior to SB 1421. So before last year, California was one of the most secretive, arguably the most secretive state in the country when it came to public information about police investigations into officers, discipline, misconduct, but even where there was not misconduct, any kind of internal investigation that could result in discipline. And that distinction dates back to the late 70s, early 80s, when the California Supreme Court, in a case called Pitches, known to every person, every public defender and district attorney, held that information in a peace officer's personnel file could be relevant and disclosed in discovery in criminal cases. And as a reaction to that, some departments around the state began shredding all of their personnel files so that they wouldn't have to disclose them. And the legislature stepped in and struck and created a law that I think at the time they thought was striking a balance, that said that agencies were required for at least 5 years to retain all information about investigations and discipline of officers, but that information would be completely confidential. And so, in terms of public information public access to information about the government, there's a Public Records Act, which generally provides that most government documents are accessible to the public unless they are confidential for some reason. Many of those exemptions are discretionary, so government agencies can for example, the general exemption for law enforcement records. A police agency can say there is an exemption for records of investigations into records of investigations by law enforcement agencies, but an agency can say, although we could withhold this, we decide to disclose it, as LAPD began to do with these videos. The law around police disciplinary records and police investigations was not discretionary. It was mandatory. Agencies were required to keep that information confidential. And one of the things that happened is, over the decades, court opinions made that, interpreted that confidentiality very expansively, so that it applied not just to findings of discipline and information about whether officers were punished, but any investigation that might result in discipline. So even an investigation into, if there's a shooting in a neighborhood, an investigation that might result in discipline would be kept secret, even if no discipline was imposed. And I think one of the things to bear in mind is that is a different rule than for every other government employee in California. For every other government employee in California, if there's an investigation and a sustained finding, or even a credible basis to think that misconduct occurred, that would be public. If it's a high-profile incident where the public has an interest, that would be public. So last year, this coalition of groups.
And the reasoning behind that, just to not get too far down the road, as long as we're going to get into the history just briefly here, Ron, the reason behind that was, I know often police unions and you have expressed concern about officer safety, about deputy safety, if that information was released.
Yes, that's correct. Not only the officer safety, but the context in which the information would be used is very concerning to us. So, you know, like we've talked about before, it's not just the headline, and it tends to be just the headline. So that's what concerns us, is the context in what it's used.
Go ahead.
Sure. So, well, I think, you know, set the stage actually a little bit more. Until 2006, actually, there was still a significant amount of information coming out, particularly in Los Angeles, because information from civilian oversight bodies like the Los Angeles Police Department's Police Commission and oversight boards up and down the state, when they conducted evaluations of officer conduct and officer shootings, those would be public. And even in LAPD, the Board of Rights in LA County, when there are appeals from discipline to the personnel, LA County Personnel Commissions, those would be public. So the public was getting information about these high-profile cases, like the Rampart scandal in the late 90s. A lot of the reporting was done through LA Times reporters and others, probably KPCC reporters, sitting in those Board of Rights proceedings. And a Supreme Court decision in 2006 held that those civilian oversight bodies were part of the agency and subject to the same confidentiality, and that really slammed the lid shut on basically all information about investigations into officer conduct. There was an attempt made the next year in the legislature to roll back just that decision that was soundly defeated, and attempts to get some more public access to information about policing and these records in 2016, which failed. No bill was even introduced in 2017, but last year, the coalition of groups that had been working on it came back and tried to pass and successfully passed SB 1421, taking California from being one of the most secretive states, where not only was, I think one of the real distinctions for California was not only was the information not available to the public, it wasn't even available to the district attorney without a court order. The police departments could not share information about officers that had histories of misconduct, including dishonesty, with the district attorneys that were using those officers and putting them on the stand to testify. Which is different from many, many other states. That about 10 states have basically complete access to all officer records. Another 15 or so have kind of middle ground access. The rules vary state to state. SB 1421 creates 3 categories, but it's still actually pretty narrow. It creates 3 categories of information that are kind of the types of information that are most important for the public to know about the law enforcement officials that are patrolling their streets. So serious uses of force, whether those are within policy or not, our information is disclosed. and then sexual assaults, if there's a finding by an agency that an officer engaged in sexual assault or sexually inappropriate conduct with a member of the public, that's disclosed. And then dishonesty by an officer in criminal prosecutions or investigation of police misconduct, that's also public. So on that last point, if an officer calls in sick when they're actually out fishing, that is not disclosed because that's not dishonesty related to a criminal prosecution. If they plant evidence, lie on a police report, or commit perjury, then that would be disclosed.
And be a little more specific about what kind of information must be released in regards to those incidents.
So it is all documents related to the incidents that fit in those categories. And there are some exemptions for, there's a provision that allows for the withholding of information if there's specific reason to believe that there's the information would pose a risk to officers, to answer the concern that Ron just raised, to protect highly personal financial or medical information, the home addresses of officers or victims, the names of victims or complainants or witnesses. There are provisions to redact that information, but otherwise any document related to incidents in those categories must be released.
Let me bounce to Taylor Walker, who's with us here. She's with Witness LA, criminal justice blog in Los Angeles, who's sort of practicing this new, using this new law to get information. How's it working out on the ground?
Recently, we have a reporter that's working on a series called Me Too Behind Bars. And her name is Lauren Lee White, and she is seeking information about a particular sexual assault that occurred in an LA County jail, a case that the county has settled, and she's been rebuffed by the Sheriff's Department. We believe this information should fall under the purview of SB 1421, and even with simple run-of-the-mill requests for data, for example, that shouldn't require a CPRA, a California Public Records Act request, and don't interfere with any open investigations. We're not getting what we need often. And when we do get a boilerplate statement, it can, in some cases, take as long as a couple of weeks.
We're going to, thank you. We're going to talk about a couple of broad areas next. One is the effect these laws are having on law enforcement agencies, cops, how they do their job, and then we'll move a little bit more into broader questions of how the broader society is being affected by these laws. But I'd like to ask you, Under Sheriff Murakami, about these concerns, sort of these continuing concerns about responses to requests for information and accusations essentially that the Sheriff's Department is not always responsive.
I can understand how you can have that perception and we're not being cooperative, but a lot has to do with the amount of requests we've received. I think so far this to the date we've received more information requests than we did all last year. So we're in the process of requesting from the Board of Supervisors additional staffing, because the biggest thing to the public records request is staff to review the information, redact anything confidential, and then releasing it to you, and that's our goal, to get it to you, but it just takes time. And there's some reporters that are just killing us. You probably know who it is, but I'm not gonna name names. But they kill us with information like, just one person has 100 requests. And so it kind of puts weight on the other groups that want to get information. So we're doing our best, though.
Sounds like a good reporter.
Yes, yeah, he or she is.
Well, in the sense of a department committing to the new regime, the new era of transparency, it would make sense to need more resources. How many people do you have in your department that responds to Public Records Act requests?
Right now, as far as I know, we have 4 staff members redacting information, and we have to grow up at least by another 10. Like I said, we're getting inundated with requests, and it just takes time to redact everything.
And this is for a department that's 9,000 plus deputies making hundreds of thousands of arrests a year.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Give us a sense how else it's affecting the department, this new era of transparency, this new requirement to respond to these requests.
Well, you know, basically, to be honest with you, some people aren't very happy about it, but to be frank with you, it's the law. And we're obligated to abide by whatever the law is. And as you know, I've been on the department 40 years, and I've seen a lot of changes, and, you know, so be it. I have no problems with it.
Now, what do you think of it? Do you think it'll be good for the department? Do you think it'll hinder the department in any way?
I don't think 1421 will hurt us in any way, other than just taking time to get all the information that's requested. But as far as harming the operation, I don't think it will at all.
Okay. Arif, how's it affecting the LAPD?
Well, I think, first, I think it's a little important to understand my role and perspective on this is as the Constitutional Policing Advisor. Part of my role is to ensure that the consent decree reforms after the Rampart scandal continue. And a part of that, two important elements of that is transparency and accountability. And so certainly this bill adds an element of transparency that is probably needed, especially to build additional public trust. And also, by what people don't realize is that, especially on the disciplinary side, there could be an officer who did something completely wrong, who was fired and it was upheld, but the chief of police didn't have the ability, and still doesn't on most disciplinary matters, to tell anybody that he or she had been fired. The law prevents that, which is very difficult when the department did the right thing, wants to show that the person was held accountable, but is prevented by a state law that doesn't allow. So typically you I'm sure have gotten this, what happened to the officer? That officer no longer works for the Los Angeles Police Department, and that's all you're going to get. And that's how police chiefs, sheriffs are hamstrung on something that is so basic as that. And I don't think you will get, I think similar to what the undersheriff is saying, much opposition from police chiefs about disclosing records about officers who have sustained findings of dishonesty in a criminal investigation or sustained findings of sexual assault. And the records we've disclosed, in some ways, we're pleased because people can see we took action and they're no longer Los Angeles police officers, and that's important for people to know. I think the real impact on us is the resource impact. And the volume of information that is required to be disclosed is huge. So it's less about what we have to disclose in terms of the incident, and as you can see, we put a lot of effort in putting out information in the right context so people can actually understand it. We do have significant resources dedicated. I mean, traditionally we get about 1,200 Public Records Act requests a year. That has increased probably 40% already because of 1421. But what's required is not just the video of the incident, not just the audio of the incident, but everything related to it. So all of the video, all of the audio, all of the reports, all the investigative material. And so what it does is, to an organization like us or the Sheriff's Department, who put a lot of resources and develop a lot of information about every single serious incident, literally thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts and reports and analysis and tracking every little thing as we do, all of that has to be disclosed. Much of which, in my opinion, will be absolutely useless to anybody who is requesting it. But that's what the law says. So every scrap of paper. Now, of course, this is all information that a police agency has collected, oftentimes from citizens and witnesses, oftentimes their addresses, their personal information. It would be irresponsible for us not to look at all of it and make sure that we're protecting their privacy interest. So I think sometimes there's this idea, well, we just need to get a copy machine and we can produce it, and that we just can't do that. And then you add on to that video, and I think you alluded to, we have 7,000 cameras. Right now, I think we're about 13 million video recordings between our in-car video and that. And then in any one incident, especially if it's prolonged, maybe it's a standoff with somebody with a knife, maybe if it's what we call a barricaded suspect, we're talking about dozens and dozens of hours of video and audio that we have to review, redact, and then produce. So I think it's less about what we have to produce in terms of the incident and what the subject matter is, but the burden that it's placed based on the way these statutes have been outlined is an enormous drain on very scarce resources.
With all due respect, the burden argument has often been used in the past to block the release of information. Nothing to see here, folks.
Right, and so that's not the argument I'm making. What I'm making is that there is the information, there is a set of information that we believe should be disclosed. And that's it's basically what happened in the incident. What's the video? What's the audio? What's that? But what's happened is it includes so much more that I think may have been an unintended consequence of what they were trying to do. In large part because people don't know how thorough we are with our investigations. Every interview with every witness, every officer is audio taped and then transcribed. And literally thousands of, and it almost penalizes those departments that put a lot of effort in keeping these records. In addition, the LAPD keeps all of its officer-involved shooting files, all of its internal affairs investigation files, and we will continue to do so. But we're almost penalized for going beyond what the law requires because we have that now and having to produce that. Whereas some other departments have decided we're not keeping them after 5 years because of the production requirements.
It's worth noting that there are maybe 50 law enforcement agencies in LA County alone. If we look at LA, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino, we're talking about upwards of 100 local police departments, sheriff's departments, all operating in different ways. Some with no person devoted to releasing public records, some who have no commitment to releasing public records, and because they're a smaller department and don't get a lot of requests from the media, they kind of get away with it, and others that are fully committed to the new era of transparency. And one of the difficulties in covering law enforcement in Southern California is that there are so many law enforcement agencies. I mean, just consider this sheriff's department, because it's the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, gets a lot more attention than the Orange County Sheriff's Department, because you're in LA County, which has a lot more media. So it remains sort of a hard thing to track for us at KPCC and at LAS. We do our best to bring you the most important incidents, the most important issues that are going on. But now might be a good time, it occurs to me, to say, under this law, anybody can file a Public Records Act. It doesn't have to be a journalist. It doesn't have to be the ACLU. It doesn't have to be the Civilian Commission. Anybody can file a Public Records Act request of their local law enforcement agency for this information relating to major uses of force, sustained instances of sexual misconduct on the job, sustained instances of dishonesty as it relates to investigations on the job, and the agency is required to release that information. One of the challenges involved is agencies to date have a history of stiff-arming these requests. It takes us too much time to put it together. We need more time. Sometimes counting on journalists to really never get back around to requesting the information, or activists. And Kim, I wouldn't mind coming to you on that, because the Youth Justice Coalition is very much a grassroots organization without a phalanx of lawyers who are ready to back up Public Records Act requests, which sometimes it takes to get information out of agencies.
Well, we have no lawyers on staff. We do occasionally get support from pro bono attorneys, and like the ACLU, for example, was a lead counsel on a lawsuit, Youth Justice Coalition versus City of LA, that removed 10,000 people from gang injunctions. And after years of work of showing how gang injunctions were not only not working for public safety, but we're also sweeping huge numbers of people into what's really tantamount to permanent probation, or what one person called a prison without walls. So we do have a lot of lawyers that we want to give credit to that support grassroots organizations and families. But for us, for sure, in most grassroots groups, we have no lawyers. But I want to say that the public doesn't have to be a lawyer to get access to this information, nor either through 1421 or other means. So I'll just give a few examples of how grassroots group led by formerly incarcerated people and our families, largely young people who are still in the system, have still been able to dig for a lot of really valuable information. The first thing we got after was the shared gang database, a totally secret file, files kept by law enforcement throughout the state and then fed into a statewide database totally run by law enforcement, not forthcoming with any kind of data, even in terms of how many people were on the database by race, gender, zip code, and the full number. And we put in the state's first PRA on that in 2012, and we're able to prove that at that time about 202,000 people were on the database. 202,000 people were on the database across the state, including young people as young as 10 years old, including majority black and brown people, although we have more white supremacy groups in California than any other place in the country, very few white people on the database. And in terms of gang injunctions, we're also able to show that there was no white neighborhoods on gang injunctions in LA County, despite the fact that there was a lot of white supremacy groups and a lot of meth running from white neighborhoods here. The second thing that was really instructive for us was looking at use of force homicides. And we work with families across the state, have a coalition called the Stop Coalition, led by families whose loved ones have been killed by law enforcement. And there, we went first to LAPD, LA County Sheriffs, and there's 57 law enforcement agencies in LA County. We couldn't look at all of them, but we went to some of the major ones and asked them for their use of force homicides, which at that time they were also required to give out by law. And every one of them had an excuse why they couldn't give us the list of who had been killed and where, and we asked also for officers involved. So we first started building the list with family members, and then we went to the coroner's office, and we had created the most exhaustive list of use of force homicides in LA County, and we're able to prove that between January 1st, 2000 and December 31st, 2017, at least 854 people were killed by law enforcement in LA County. Then we looked at what was happening in terms of use of force homicides by year. This is all, again, being done by people that don't have lawyers, are not paid, are volunteers largely. And when we looked at it by year, we found that not only was use of force homicides overwhelming in LA County when compared to other large cities, large counties in the country, New York City, Miami, Chicago weren't even close to us in terms of numbers or rates. And when you look at rates of use of force across the nation, of the 15 areas with the highest use of force rates, 5 of them are in California, including Kern County, #1 in the nation use of force homicide rates, Long Beach being right up there in the number top 5. And then LA County sheriffs and LAPD were always neck and neck 1 and 2, and still are, on the number of use of force homicides each year. The other thing we were able to show, which I think was really alarming, was that in the early 2000s, when the overall homicides were twice as high, use of force homicides were lower, both in real numbers and as a percentage of overall homicides. That meant that between 2% and 3% of homicides in LA County in the early 2000s were caused by law enforcement. And now between 6% and 8% of homicides in LA County are police killing people. So as the community has gotten a lot less violent, you could argue, or had a lot less homicides that it's allegedly committed, law enforcement is killing more people. And so what was particularly disturbing to us with the passing of 1421, and we're really encouraged, of course, with its passing, and celebrate all the work that young people and families did as part of this larger coalition, and are really honored to be in that coalition. With the first PRA that we wanted to put in was for Inglewood. And the mayor of Inglewood, who was also a former police chief at the airport under LAPD Airport Division, as well as Santa Monica Police Department, immediately shredded the records and said publicly that he would do it. So when law enforcement constantly tell us that their job is only to obey the law, to follow the law as it's established by the state legislature, and that's your first move, that doesn't engender trust with the community. Particularly because 2 of those years that they destroyed were years when the homicides by law enforcement in Inglewood were 15% of the overall killings in Inglewood for those 2 years. The second thing that has been alarming to us, and again, feeling very encouraged by this law, but our family members, we did a workshop for them on how to put in a PRA, and they immediately put in their PRAs for their cases, several of them. And just a few of them, I just want to give, we don't have time for everything, but just a few of the difficulties they've had. For Cesar Cruz's family, who was killed by Anaheim PD, and Anaheim PD is one of those top 5 jurisdictions in the nation. They're charging that family, who's low income, and the mom is raising her grandkids who were left behind when her son was killed. They're charging her a deposit of $3,000 plus $80 an hour for every hour that it takes to put together her records. So she's gotten no records. For Antonio Guzman Lopez's family, who was killed by San Jose State University, they did release one video, and that was incredible for the family because it was the first time seeing how their husband was killed. And while that was incredibly painful and will always be painful for them, I think it's better than not knowing. At least that's what families say. And they released some pages of a report, but they've denied all other videos, the 911 call, and most importantly, would give them no information on the police involved, although the law clearly states that they must. Michael Barrera, killed by Woodland PD in 2017, got 5 pages of a report that they already had. And then Jason Alderman, killed in Bakersfield PD, was given that there's lawsuits pending and they wouldn't release any information. The last thing I would say is that the other place you can go for information is with the DA, and I think that's the other place that's been incredibly disappointing. So LA County, we were wondering why was there hardly any indictments, given the fact that we're so high in the numbers of use of force homicides. And going all the way back to 2000, I think there's been 1 indictment. So we put in a PRA to the DA's office for use of force reports, as well as for the MOU that they have with all 57 law enforcement agencies in LA County, stating that they will not even start their investigation until the police agency's investigation is exhausted. So even though they're supposed to be the investigative arm around crimes or criminal misconduct in LA County, they're not even doing these investigations until the case is already a cold case. They do send a team out to the scene. Beyond that, they do no investigation. So we were able to get that MOU for the first time. They never released it to anyone else through a PRA. And we got 319 reports from the DA's office on use of force. And then we had volunteers come in, including all community members, but including family members whose loved ones have been killed, to look at those reports. And I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of time. But the other thing that those reports revealed was this. The same paragraph existed in every single report that the DA gave us, which is, this report is based entirely on the records we got from law enforcement, on the investigation that was done from law enforcement. And then on all of those reports, the end of the paragraph was all the same, which was, we find this use of force justifiable. So it's through data that we've been able to prove, and families have been able to prove, that we don't feel like we have justice, that even with transparency, law enforcement balks at every opportunity. How many lawsuits are now in California pending to try to challenge 1421?
Yeah, police unions have filed certainly more than a dozen lawsuits up and down the state to try to halt.
There are a couple of things that occur to me. One of them is, are you hopeful, Peter, Kim, that you have the number of killing, and this is sort of, I'm anticipating Ron's concern here. You can say how many people were killed by law enforcement officers. Are you hopeful that getting the files behind that use of force, behind that lethal use of force, will be able to tell you, oh, that looked pretty legitimate, or no, because you're certainly suggesting that they were all wrong, a misuse of force. So are you hopeful that getting the more information will be able to allow you to better discern, hey, you know, a lot of these shootings were good, a lot of these shootings were bad, or at least make a more informed decision? Because I know, Ron, that's something you've raised concerns about. So,
yes, I mean, look, I think, to circle back to your introduction and your concern about democracy, I mean, the whole idea behind this is basically to have police accountable in the way that they need to be in a democracy. I mean, our democracy works because people know what their government is doing, and if the government is acting in a way that the people don't like, we can vote them out. But if the government keeps secret everything it's doing, then we can't hold them accountable. And so I think that's exactly the hope, that when there's full access to.
But how realistic is it to go through an entire file for each and every law enforcement lethal use of force and determine independently, gee, this is a good one, this is a bad one?
Well, I think it's entirely realistic. This is an extraordinary, a police officer killing a member of the community has an extraordinary impact on that person's family, on the community. There are people that are, I'm not going to go through every single one of the thousands in California, but somebody is, their family members are. And we've already seen, we've already seen information come out that has reshaped the way that we think about certain incidents, and the way that, and most importantly, the way that we think about the agency's response to those incidents. So to give one example, Oscar Grant, right? The individual who was killed on New Year's Eve in the BART station, in Fruitvale BART station by BART police.
The officer thought he was pulling a taser. His story thought he was pulling the taser and ended up shooting him.
Right, and that is the narrative that came out. The officer was convicted for involuntary manslaughter under this theory that he had mistakenly and negligently pulled his taser instead of his gun. And that is what everybody has thought. A report, the 1421 request filed by his family revealed a new video and an investigation conducted by the city that found, first of all, another officer on the scene who had escalated the situation, had used racial slurs, and behaved in a really troubling way that escalated the situation and likely led to the shooting, and a video that showed Officer Messerly looking at his gun as he was drawing it, and a report that contained the conclusion by the investigator, the BART police retained a law firm to conduct an investigation, and that law firm concluded that he knew he was drawing his gun. And it has changed the narrative, or the public narrative around that incident. I mean, essentially, we were all misled, and access to that information changes the way we think about it, changes the steps that need to be taken. I mean, you had agencies going off saying like, gosh, it's so easy to draw a taser instead of a gun. We look at this incident, we need to take care, to address that problem. And that wasn't the problem. You have agencies, the Celeste Guap controversy with a number of Bay Area agencies where there was a scandal involving an underage prostitute. Yeah. One of the revelations that came out just this week is that one of the officers that engaged in sexual conduct with this young woman, I think she had just turned 18 at the time, who was a witness and a victim, was restored to his job. He's still working at the Richmond Police Department. The agency decided to fire him, and that firing was overturned, and that raises serious questions, I think, for the public about the way that the officer discipline system in that jurisdiction works.
Ron, you had a union that represents 9,000 sworn guys and women on the streets every day. Are you hopeful, or are you worried about this new era of transparency and how it will reflect on policing? In other words, with these revelations, are you worried that people will lose confidence in law enforcement, in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, or that it will, or I shouldn't do either or, there could be another opinion you have, but what is your feeling about this new era of transparency and how it will affect how you do your job?
I'm hopeful that it's one of those things that, like speaking for ALEDs, part of the reason that we took it to court was because of the fact that there was going to be stuff in there that went way back into time. And what a lot of people don't understand, especially in law enforcement, I can't speak for other professions, but I can speak for law enforcement, especially in law enforcement, if something happens in your career and you're looking at some sort of discipline, and there may be a negotiation for one reason or another in your discipline because you want to get on your career, you want everybody to get closure, so to speak, on the particular incident. And when you make that decision based on something that happened 15, 20 years ago, and now fast forward to today, and all that information is going to be out there, there's a lot of incidences where they would have said, well, you know what, that was a false allegation, but it was a he said, she said, and based on the circumstances, I just figured I need to get on with my career. Now, what's the remedy for them to fix that? I mean, that information is now going to be out there. So what I'm hopeful for is I think the same thing that we're starting to see with the video cameras. Everybody wanted video cameras. The public wanted video cameras. Quite frankly, we don't mind video cameras. But what ended happening with the video cameras is it started coming out that people weren't seeing, I think, what they thought they were going to see. And I think what people were looking for and what they were led to believe is they were going to see a lot of misconduct by law enforcement. And that's not really happening. I actually witnessed in a Civilian Oversight Commission meeting where we had a faction of people who were screaming and yelling, demanding for the Sheriff's Department to quit stalling and get video cameras already. And just by happenstance, also on the agenda was our department doing a presentation on video cameras and what it would cost and how we're looking forward to this and what they've investigated into what's coming out in these video cameras. That same faction, an hour later, got up and started screaming about quit wasting money on video cameras, let's do something else. So that's the thing that worries me. But when it comes to 1421, I think my members are a little concerned for the context, for the safety of themselves, family members. Believe it or not, a lot of people don't believe this, but somebody mentioned about how in these files or information, having to do with the community and stuff, we have to make sure that the wrong information doesn't get out there. If it's going to get out there, it's the right. We look at it like it's the law. We're going to comply. We just want to make sure it's in the right context and that it doesn't get blown out of proportion. And I'd also like to touch on, and I don't want to be accusatory, but there's a bill right now that's being fought. Some of you may know about the use of force bill. And what I've heard over and over again when we talk about these shootings, it's been portrayed over and over again that in the United States last year, 172 people were shot by law enforcement. And there's been a big production about how that's done. And it looks bad, except for when you talk about only 13 of those people were unarmed. I mean, didn't have guns. The rest of them had some sort of weapon. And you can even I'll even talk about the one, the main case that spawned the whole bill that we're dealing with, and that's the Stephon Clark shooting. And nobody wants to talk about all the details about the fact that the actions that were seen by the law enforcement were actually consistent with his mental state, based on talking to the family that he was suicidal, and he had talked about dying and all this. So one could argue that, did he cause this on purpose? He ended up being not armed, but the video shows that he made a motion with a cell phone with a light that could be determined to be, maybe you think you saw a flash. The officers, if you watch the video, simply look at each other and like, are you hit? Are you hit? They believe they're shot at. So my big thing is that the information itself getting out there, as long as it's in the right context and everybody understands the totality of this. It was mentioned about justified shootings. That's a good word to use. I've heard good shootings. There's no such thing as a good shooting. I mean, not for obviously for the person who was shot, and not for law enforcement either. But justified, we don't go out there and purposely put ourselves in those situations. They're created by others, and we have to worry about our safety also.
Appreciate your willingness to go along with state law that you guys fought kicking and screaming all along. Are there? I want to point out something my news director pointed out. News director, my editor. Interestingly, all of these videos that LAPD has produced, 30 of them, 30, 40 public, the past year or so, none of them have created an outpouring of controversy, anger. None of them have, has resulted in, this huge, like, oh my God, this is a terrible shooting. So it's interesting, as information is released, the public seems able to get the information and digest it. I want to stop for questions. I'm going to get to Brian. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. We have the executive director of the newly created Civilian Oversight Commission of the Sheriff's Department. But before we do that, are there any questions in the audience? I can't see, so we meant to go to this a little bit earlier, but things happen sometimes slower than they're supposed to, especially with me. So just say your name and maybe what community you're from and fire a question.
My name's Lloyd. I'm from Los Angeles. My name's Lloyd. I've been hearing about the meager resources that the LAPD has. What is the annual budget of the LAPD?
$2 billion plus when you throw in all the grants.
96% is actually all to labor. Part of it is, I don't intend to go through a detailed budget accounting, but there are limited resources, and we're trying to do many things. That's not to say that we're not willing to, and we are dedicating the resources. Part of what I was saying is that there are many of those resources that are going to things that I don't think the legislatures realized will not produce much value in terms of some of the extraneous things. But I think as Frank alluded to, the LAPD, which has evolved considerably on the issue of transparency back from the 70s when Peter had referred to the shredding of documents after the Pitchess decision, which was actually the LAPD, to after that, being the first agency to disclose the names of officers involved with shootings long before the Supreme Court required it, that had open Board of Rights hearings, which are the hearings that are required in order to discharge an officer. 2, disclosing video and actually adopting body-worn cameras before Ferguson, in-car video, et cetera, to what we were doing now. And I think the most important thing about what we're doing now and dedicating the resources for is exactly what you're talking about, informing the public. I think agencies, and we were one of them, we were so afraid of just releasing raw video and then people will not understand what they're seeing. And what we've learned is the way and this is very methodical and much longer than I know time permitted to show, but we try to use it as an opportunity to inform the public about what happened, the full context, you know, what is a body camera, what is less lethal, because we sort of assume everybody understands that. And the response has been very positive, much more than I expected, not only by the public, but by the media. I think I've seen much better reporting and realized that's because we've provided more information and context. And other agencies throughout the country are always talking about these as ways to learn how things to do and do better. And for those of you who've seen them, not all of them are situations where we did the right thing. We've released, I mean, just yesterday, the police commission and the chief of police held a shooting out of policy involving in Van Nuys in that situation, and tragic. The hostage was killed in the Officerville shooting. But it's an example of how we can embrace this, dedicate the resources necessary, and hopefully, you know, inform the public in a better way.
Brian, if I could just call on you for a quick second. Brian Williams used to host the NBC Nightly News. This is a different Brian Williams. I'm sorry.
Right.
It's the obvious joke, I know. But he's now the executive director of the Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission, which was created a little over 2 years ago by the Board of Supervisors in the wake of the abrupt resignation of Sheriff Baca and the revelations of, you know, a pattern and practice of inmate abuse by jail deputies, a federal investigation that led to 20-plus indictments, including of the sheriff. So your organization was born out of really a crisis at the Sheriff's Department. And your organization was not given subpoena power, was not given special access to department documents. Talk a bit about your ability to peek into the department and fulfill your mission of evaluating its policies and practices and making recommendations.
Well, let me say this. Kind of first, I want to comment upon this discussion just a little bit, and that is to say this, that I believe that part of policing is keeping the public informed. It's not just enforcing the law. Part of that is keeping the public informed. And we hear at our commission meetings all the time the tremendous amount of frustration from members of the community because they just don't know what's going on because of a lack of information from multiple departments. We hear, not just the Sheriff's Department, but we hear about other departments as well. And so when you have that lack of information, what happens? People fill that information in, and a lot of times that information is false, and that causes trouble for everyone. So I think it's in everyone's best interest to provide as much information as possible and not see this as a burden, but really more as an opportunity. My 2 cents on that. 4 cents. So just in terms of our ability to receive information, it's been honestly sort of a hit and miss. And this is not an indictment of the current sheriff, but it's been that way since our inception. We'll ask for some information and we'll get that information at times. There are other times where we'll request information and the department will treat it as a PRA. They're saying, okay, well, we recognize that you want this information and we'll get it to you within a certain amount of time. And it's really, at times, slow coming to us. We are a civilian organization that does not have subpoena power, but for the first time in open session at our meeting yesterday, there were commissioners who were asking for subpoena power. And I think that's born out of some of the frustrations that we have in terms of not receiving information as quickly as we'd like, and more importantly, perhaps not having the witnesses before our commission that we'd like to see.
And have you perceived a difference, and I'm just going to ask it, between Sheriff Villanueva and Sheriff McDonald?
One's taller than the other, right? There's the whole atmosphere is different, right? They're two different folks. They have two different management styles. We know that there's a learning curve for this current sheriff to learn about us and for us to learn about him. It's been difficult because of the politics involved and everything right now. So there is a discernible difference in a sense. We were sort of in a groove with the previous sheriff. They knew what we wanted. We had difficulty at times of getting information, but we were getting there. There's a new staff there now. I think we're learning one another, so we have some difficulties there. There are some things that we're not happy about right now, and we're being very vociferous about those. So it's an iterative process for us, and we're learning and they're learning.
What are you most not happy about?
Well, I mean, yesterday at our meeting, for example, we spent quite a bit of time talking about inactivation of disciplinary cases. That's a big issue for us. Of course, the rehiring of certain deputies, that's a big issue for us. Transparency and accountability has been a long-standing issue for us. So there are quite a few issues that we're faced with right now. And I can't sit here and say they're all endemic to the current sheriff. Some of those are long-standing issues, but certainly most recently we are concerned about the rehiring of those deputies and some of the inactivations that have been going on.
It's worth noting for people who don't know, I'm always astounded by people who don't know the difference between the Sheriff's Department and the LAPD. But the LAPD
We have
is
better uniforms.
One's blue, one's tan. But you're not sworn. Arif is a civilian member, but the Los Angeles Police Department is by city charter overseen by the 5 members, civilian members of the police commission, who are appointed by the mayor. And it is those 5 members who recommend to the mayor who should be chief. And that is a very different system from the sheriff's department, which is completely and wholly operated by the sheriff of Los Angeles County, who is elected by the voters of Los Angeles County. So the sheriff really is beholden to nobody but the law, of course, and to the voters. I suppose in that sense, I would like to hear from the undersheriff about, why, the sheriff's department historically has been slower to adopt transparency measures. It was, I think, just last year that you only had 1.5 people in your Public Records Act request unit. So I guess I would ask you to talk a bit about, how you see the sheriff moving into a new era. I know you've made the request for the new budget, but this is a department with a history that has not necessarily been good on transparency.
Well, that's a good question, and we're going to do our best to be as open as possible and forthcoming with information. Even with what the director mentioned about our discussions yesterday, we're working on getting them a document, trying to explain some of the change of discipline that they questioned. And what it is basically is the initial report was prepared by the Inspector General's office. And it's not their fault, but they have limited data to write upon. So initially what they did, they wrote down what the charge line was on the allegation of misconduct, but they didn't have the information behind it, how the decisions were made in terms of changing the discipline.
Why didn't they have that information?
Because they can't have access to it. It's a poll bar violation.
Even for the Inspector General? I thought there was an agreement with the Inspector General.
There's agreements to what they can look at, but as far as the further information, they don't have access to that. And that's even like when we had the article in a newspaper, I won't name it, a newspaper that talked about how the sheriff reinstated 6 people that were fired. And that was the headline. Well, that, yes and no. 4 of those were civil service. 1 was because the statute fell off, and the 6th one, you didn't reinstate. But the way the information read to the public is that we brought back 6 people that were fired. So,
Well, one of the
Yeah.
challenges, I've got to go on the record with this, Mr. Undersheriff. One of the challenges of covering the sheriff is there have been examples of where he's said things like, I did not choose to reinstate this deputy Mandoyan until after review by a panel, when there became evidence that he had made that decision, or at least was advocating for his reinstatement, before he even took office. And I know you're the undersheriff, you're not the sheriff, but I think that, at least indicates to folks like me, we'll have to kind of pay close attention when we're covering. Do you understand that concern on our part?
Sure. I think a lot to do with the amount of information that you receive. And what happened is that that matter right now is a litigation. But as we go to Superior Court, where it's at, some of the facts that aided the department in making that decision will come forth. And it may change your perspective once it comes out, but I can't discuss that right now.
Let me, quick...
I just wanted to jump in here and highlight one of these issues. We're talking about a civilian oversight commission that is created by the County of Los Angeles, the Board of Supervisors, to supervise the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, its own Sheriff's Department, and the Inspector General.
Technically not supervise, but provide a watchdog
oversight.
Oversight,
right.
yeah.
And the Inspector General that is charged, again, created by the Board of Supervisors, is the entity of the County of Los Angeles charged with investigating, overseeing the Sheriff's Department. And what we're hearing is that POBAR, the state law, bars those entities from accessing the records of the people that they are supposed to oversee. And, look, as it happens, I actually believe you're wrong. I believe that for the same reason that the Supreme Court held that civilian oversight boards' decisions were protected by this law and made confidential, that information can be shared with them as long as they're in the chain of review. But honestly, if you're right, it's even more of a problem. If our state law prohibits counties from creating Inspector General's office and civilian oversight commissions that can actually function because by having access to information and providing oversight, that's a huge problem and really gives a sense of the obstacles that we're up against.
Do you want to respond to that, Mr. Undersheriff? Like, what's your concern?
What happened is that part of the problem with yesterday's meeting is that they wanted things discussed in open forum. We can't do that. I don't plan on getting sued or violating somebody's rights. But the plan is I plan to give them a redacted fact sheet so they get the information. But in a public forum, we can't discuss it. Even though they wanted to, we can't. That was what the fear was. But we're not going to withhold information from them.
Is that true? Let me go back to Brian Williams. Is it your sense that the Sheriff's Department is indeed withholding information that you're entitled to?
I want to be pretty clear on this. In an email that I sent to one of the lieutenants prior to the meeting, I was very clear. I said very clearly, we do not want to violate any confidentiality rules. We are fully aware of what we can and cannot discuss in open forum, in an open session. And so we wanted to limit our questioning to what could be discussed that was already in the public domain from the OIG report. Our chair at our meeting yesterday reiterated the exact same thing. So perhaps there's a misunderstanding or some confusion here, but it was not our intent to discuss any specific confidential issues as it pertained to any specific deputies.
So I think what you're seeing playing out here is a continuing struggle to crack open police departments and sheriff's departments. Crack open may be a little, maybe a little heavy, but because I think the sense is, and guys, tell me if I'm wrong, that if the public sees too much, they'll draw the wrong conclusions, or they won't have the context of incidents to give a fair viewing of it, which is interesting to me because, at least in one of the best examples, which is the release of all these videos from the LAPD, the public has, viewed them pretty, pretty evenly. You know, they haven't come out and said, my God, they're shooting people right and left. They've raised some questions on some, but not huge questions. So I don't know if either of you guys want to comment on that before we get to that, Ron or the undersheriff.
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit on it. There is, you know, a fear of that, of how the perception of just getting the information without an actual dialogue, without an actual face-to-face. So when a lot of people think that we're afraid to give the information, you're giving information without the ability, because there's so many requests, without the ability to actually sit down with somebody one-on-one and have them ask individual questions about that. And it goes back to what my big fear is and what my membership's fear is and what I've seen throughout my career. I've been at incidences where I've seen the whole thing play out, and then I see it in the newspaper on the news later on, and I'm like, what? I was there. That's not exactly what happened. But because there's nobody there to create that dialogue. I don't blame the public for that. It's not really our fault either. I mean, it would be almost impossible to sit down and talk about every incident. I hope more in the future, because this is where we're going, that there is more of an opportunity. But one of the things, too, that I think that I need to point out that was mentioned earlier, and we haven't really gone around, instead of public viewing it as the department or law enforcement stonewalling, take into account the fact that this 1421 just came out. So the massive amounts of requests coming in may appear to be stonewalling, but really what it is, it's the first year of doing this. I would think that in the future, I don't know how many years or whatever into the future, that it's going to be because we got all the initial requests out of the way, that now it's going to be a smoother process. And that's what I truly believe is going to happen.
I want to shift. We don't have much time left here, but I just wanted to hit on, we would be remiss if we didn't, on the California State Supreme Court case involving the Brady issue, which is going to be heard in downtown LA in about 2 weeks. The California Supreme Court will hear the case of the Association of Los Angeles County Deputy Sheriffs versus the Sheriff's Department, and specifically Sheriff McDonald. Former Sheriff McDonald decided that it was a good idea to get a good list of deputies who he felt may have credibility problems, and give that list to the district attorney, so that if the district attorney were going to call one of those deputies up during a criminal case, that the deputy DA involved, the prosecutor, would be able to say, we might have credibility problems with this person. It's our obligation under a United States Supreme Court case called Brady to inform the judge, to inform the defense that, hey, this person may have credibility problems. The union sued and said the list is not a good one, that there are people on that list who should not be on that list. They're good deputies who were just wrongly put on a list of deputies who might have credibility problems. And the case has now gone all the way up to the California Supreme Court. It's an incredibly important case. Defense attorneys who have defended people accused of crimes in the state for decades have complained that there have been deputies, there have been police officers on the stand who had credibility problems, but they didn't know about them, and they should have had the right to raise those credibility problems during the course of a trial, or even during the course of plea negotiations, you know, and say, hey, look, you know, you've got a guy who arrested our guy who might have been lying. I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I probably already am. But this was a case that originated with previous Sheriff McDonald wanting to hand this list over to the district attorney so that she would have a ready-made list. Anytime this deputy came up, it'd be a flag. It wouldn't be an indictment. It would be a flag. So I have to ask you, Under Sheriff Murakami, what is this sheriff's position in this case? Because it was a case, you know, that originated under the previous sheriff.
I discussed it with the sheriff, and his response was basically similar to what Alan is saying, that he supports providing the list, but he wants it properly vetted too, because he believes there's deputies on the list that shouldn't be on there.
Could you explain that a little more further, why he believes that?
I think what happened is that he believes that under the former administration, some deputies were charged with violations of maybe not being honest, and it wasn't a valid allegation. So he doesn't believe they should be on that list.
Does he have a sense of how many? This is a list of about 300 deputies, is that about right?
I believe so.
Neighborhood. Does he have a sense of how many he thinks should not be on that list?
That I don't know, how many it would involve, but that's the response. But I know there's one deputy I work with at an industry that's on that list, and he got kind of duped into it, where he's working a custody assignment. He got into some type of trouble. The captain at the time advised him to sign this agreement, and he signed it thinking, okay, but he didn't realize what he's signing actually put him on that list. So he regrets it now, but he's on the list now, and so he's going to fight that.
Ron, you guys obviously have challenged the handing over of this list to the district attorney. I believe that you don't want any list handed over, whatever list it is. Is that right? Or is it this list in particular where there may be deputies, in the undersheriff's opinion, who shouldn't be on there?
It's the latter. We're not talking about if there's a list and there's been behavior in the past that, based on the criteria of Brady, that puts you on that list. That's a whole different situation. What we were basically fighting is the validity of the list that was being put forward. And one of the main reasons was because, first off, everybody has to understand, I may be the president of this union, but I don't know every situation. There's lawyer-client privilege, that kind of stuff. So we find these things out when somebody comes to us and says, hey, I've been notified, and then their story comes out, and we're like, okay, so it's one of those things that if there's one person on there that is suspicious on whether they should be on there, then we got to assume there might be more. So it's the validity of the list, not the list itself being handed over, but the validity of the list itself.
Of the names on the list.
Correct.
Peter, do you want to comment on this? And just so I'm clear, this is a 1964 United States Supreme Court decision that required prosecutors to reveal evidence to defense attorneys that may be exculpatory, that may say, hey, this guy may not have done this crime. And just to remind everybody, state prosecutors act in the name of the people of the state of California. Defense attorneys are solely obligated to defend who they're defending. So state prosecutors have a higher bar in terms of how they operate. And Brady is one of the distinctions. Brady requires them, state prosecutors, district attorneys, to reveal any evidence they get that may be exculpatory, that may point to somebody's innocence. And an officer or a deputy's potential for lying in the past could be such evidence. You want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. So under Brady, prosecutors have an obligation to turn over evidence that might bear on the credibility of, might be exculpatory, tend to prove the defendant's innocence, including, in subsequent cases, evidence about the credibility of the officer. And I think, there are a couple of important things. The cases have held that that duty, it's not just about the one prosecutor who stands up in front of the courtroom. That's a duty that attaches to the entire prosecution team, including the police department. Yes, sorry. There are many people who know more about this, including members of the audience like Ron Kay there. And we have, because of these laws, these confidentiality laws in California, a history that police departments have not turned over, police agencies and sheriff's departments have not turned over information about the credibility or a sustained finding of dishonesty against their officers, haven't given that to the district attorney. And so the district attorney's office, in order to disclose that, in order to even get access to that, they have to file a motion with the court. It's it's not a trivial thing, and it doesn't happen in every case. And in order to make sure that the justice system has integrity and that prosecution teams are abiding by Brady, they have to have access to that information. And so I think whatever the state law is, the Constitution trumps. And in fact, disclosure of lists like this should in fact be not only allowed, but mandatory. That's actually further than Sheriff McDonnell argued.
And I believe there are some counties in the state that do provide the list to district attorneys?
Yes. I mean,
a couple of them. I think Santa Clara does. I think San Francisco does.
Yeah, and in fact, the Supreme Court has previously basically blessed this system in San Francisco.
Okay. Kim?
I just want to give a human cost to a lack of transparency, because I think a lot of numbers have been thrown around, and every single number has a person behind it, behind them a family, behind them a community. And when we lack transparency, we also lack safety. So in Jonathan Cuevas' case, he was killed by the LA County Sheriffs in 2010. When we looked at the files from and I encourage you to go online, because the other thing that's caused transparency is security cameras or just people's cell phones that has released a lot of evidence when law enforcement hasn't. And if you go online, you can see his shooting, including being shot several times in the back as he's running away. And when we went into the DA's reports, we found that Deputy Jove, was involved in at least one other use of force resulting in homicide. People should know that, because that protects against not only the public, but commanders, command staff that doesn't have that information, that needs to know that information. Secondly, when people are transferred with sexual misconduct or dishonesty on the job or uses of force, and it requires sustained allegations of sexual misconduct and dishonesty on the job. I want to highlight that. It's not that these are old allegations. These are old, in some cases, that people are afraid to come out, sustained allegations or recent sustained allegations. But when someone's transferred or they leave the department to go to another department, their new commanders, the people interviewing them, can't even get that information. So it makes law enforcement agencies dangerous and impossible to supervise. The second thing is that we have young people under the custody of the probation department in juvenile halls and camps that have been sexually violated, sexually molested, and in some cases assaulted, raped, by officers that have had multiple charges. And so if you're a parent, these are people that are caring for your young people, your children. Until recently, with a change in law that we worked on, it was young people as young as 7 that could be detained at a juvenile hall. If you're a parent of some young people not much older, it means that majority of the people that get killed inside the county jails are on the younger end. We worked with families most of the time as 18, 19, 20-year-olds found dead in the county jails. These are people that are caring for your children. The other thing to know is that within hours of a use of force shooting, we know everything about the victim, and most of it is untrue or highly exaggerated. We know if they're on probation or parole. We hear all the allegations of their gang involved. They were armed, they were running away, they were shooting at officers, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes, very different details come out weeks later, and that never makes the news. So these same law enforcement agencies that balk at transparency when it comes to protecting their own officers have no problem sharing information that they haven't even investigated yet, sharing rumors, really, about the public. And then community members and their families are demonized once again in the court of public opinion. And then finally, I would say that there's misinformation that's given out all the time. The 172 people that were mentioned that were killed in California in 1 year, 2017, not in the nation. And 50% of them were unarmed, not 13. When we looked at LA County, 40% of the people killed have mental conditions. That's information that the public needs to know, because what's not happening is de-escalation tactics, calling in mental health resources, even when they exist in departments, to slow the whole thing down. When we looked at the DA's reports, we found that most use of force incidents were happening within minutes of the contact. When we all know as the public who are unarmed, who don't have tasers, don't have guns, don't have pepper spray, that it requires us to slow down all our encounters that could be lethal. And then the final thing I would say is that on the budget issue, we need to push for transparency on all issues, including the budget. You mentioned, why don't we have the money to release information in departments? And the response was that the departments are strapped and have too little cash or too little budget. But if you look at the LA County Sheriff's, LAPD, and LA County Probation, In the last 10 years, we've seen this historic drop in crime and historic drop in custody, particularly among young people. Most of the juvenile halls and camps are 1/3 full. But the Sheriff's Department's budget gone up by $1 billion in that time. LAPD's budget's gone up by $950 million in that time. And the Probation Department's budget's gone up by $500 million in that time to nearly $1 billion. At a time when we're at historic drops in crime and they have less people in custody and they're arresting less people. At the same time, you look at budgets across the county, and I'm sorry I'm taking a lot of time, but 54% of most of our city's budgets in LAPD for sure gets 54% of the tax revenue. That's 70 times what young people get in the budget.
54% of general fund.
Right. So
these are important statistics and fodder for asking questions, really. And hopefully in this era where they are going to be, law enforcement agencies are going to be required to release more information, there'll be context around these numbers. I saw Ron shaking his head about the number of people who were unarmed. Definition of unarmed is really important. Does that mean
tree branches being armed?
Sure.
Tree screwdrivers being armed, knives being armed.
Right.
We're talking about unarmed.
Right. So in our study, I think it covered 2010 to 2014. We found about 20 to 25%. I don't remember the exact number. Unarmed, and we did count armed as knives. Weapons that look like guns but were not guns. So the perception stuff. But what we're really talking about here is getting more information about the agencies that police us. Because I think the Pew studies are showing that trust continues to fall in agencies. And this is a really, really important question that if trust in our local law enforcement rests on transparency, and if my proposition at the beginning that the democracy may depend on it, this is really important stuff. And something else that some Pew studies have shown, and some articles have been written about, is a disconnect between rank and file and the communities they police. A sense of not being supported. And so, these studies come and go, views wane, they wax and wane. But I consider these matters to be supremely important to our confidence in how our government works and how we as a society are operating. It's 8:45, and we probably should have wrapped it up pretty soon. Should we take a couple quick questions? I know we've been talking a lot up here. Hopefully it's been illustrative, but let's go to the gentleman in the middle. I can't see, so please say your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm not from California. I'm visiting from Baltimore City.
Welcome.
I think that part is actually quite important because for those of you that don't know, Baltimore is kind of a paradoxical place because it has very high rates of violent crime. But it also has one of the most corrupt police forces in the country, as well as one of the most progressive community organizations in the country, and violence de-escalation organizations, which are expectedly quite underfunded, and the police force, much like the one here, is quite wealthy. And so my question is, I guess it's a little bit broad, but I'm curious about what the panel thinks of investigating or funding solutions addressing crime that don't necessarily involve a formal law enforcement structure. So maybe community solutions or ceasefire organizations that work explicitly as de-escalation, community-centered, or kind of bottom-up anti-crime solutions that, I guess, according to research conducted in Baltimore City, have been actually quite effective compared to traditional law enforcement. Yeah.
I'd like to hear from Arif on that, because you guys have actually done pretty well with former gang members, and even, I believe, send out notices, immediate notices when there's some violence in an area, and they come help you.
Sure. I think what this goes to is the fundamental shift in the LAPD was its relationship with the community, and the realization that the community are partners and not the problem. And in that partnership is things like better communication, which goes to transparency. We have gang intervention workers, we have community activists, others. So when we have a shooting, because we know from those situations the probability of a retaliatory shooting and then another one is very high. And if we didn't have that community involvement, those partnerships with the community, crime would be much higher. And I think, Bill Bratton, when he was the chief here, made it very clear, policing is not going to arrest ourselves out of the problem of gang violence or other types of violence. And although I know it's understandable why people think that police departments are filled with cash because it is the largest cost of any municipal agency, but the reality is, and we will never have enough police officers to take care of the crime problem by ourselves, nor should we. We're a democracy, we're representing the community, it has to be a collective effort. So leveraging the expertise, the understanding, the care, the dedication of community groups, whether they're former gang members or community activists or clergy, has really made the difference in why LA has seen dramatic drops in crime at levels that I don't think in 1992, when you came to Los Angeles and we had nearly 1,100 homicides, anybody ever thought we would be at. But there's much work to do, and the only way we can do that is with the community aspect that you're talking about.
I have to confess, under Sheriff Murakami, I've not necessarily seen, but maybe it's just because I haven't not reported on, sort of similar collaborations with former gang members and organizations where they are immediately informed when there's violence to come help suppress rumors. Often it's the rumors that result in retaliatory shootings. Do you have those kind of relationships?
In South LA, we do have the help of some former gang members that act as mediators, but also we rely upon the clergy quite a bit, disseminate information, and in a lot of these communities, the pastors or any type of other clergy are well respected. So we use them as an avenue to talk to people, or even like in, for instance, in Carson, Brian and I worked together on a problem with a shooting where it involved Hispanic gang versus Samoan gang. We intervened using a community meeting, talking to the elders of the Samoan community, and then Brian helped. Also, we talked about the fact the suspect was identified and arrested because we were concerned about retaliation. So we used community leadership, talked to the community, and also worked with Brian and then the oversight committee to resolve that.
Another question.
I'm from Pasadena now, but I was from South LA. My question, a couple of the panel members touched on it, is the deadly use of force bill that's in the assembly right now, AB 392, I believe it is, and I'd like to hear the opinions of different members of the panel.
This is a bill that would change the standard by which shootings would be evaluated as legal or not legal. And, I could launch into a description of that, but Peter, would you just give a very brief description, since I think you guys are one of the big backers of that bill?
Sure. Like SB 1421, it's the ACLU, YJC, and a broad coalition of community organizations and family members of people who've been killed by police. Sure. I mean, the basic idea behind the bill is to police officers are authorized to use deadly force in part under California law, which has provisions that create exceptions for the crimes of homicide for public officers who kill people, and in part by another provision that affirmatively authorizes police to use force. And those statutes are old. The first one was actually dates from 1872, the adoption of California's penal code when we first became a state. It's the oldest law in the country, use of force law. And the second one dates from the 50s. Courts, through the standards, through the court interpretation and the Supreme Court's rulings around when use of force violates somebody's federal constitutional rights, basically the prevailing standard is that police can use deadly force when reasonable. that's a very squishy standard. One of the professors that we talked to, who's an expert on the use of force and a former officer, has talked about that as if I take you out to a park and want to show you a new kind of ball game, and you ask the rules, and I say you get it in the net and you do what's reasonable, it doesn't actually provide you very much guidance. So the bill would change that standard to basically a simple rule that officers can use deadly force only when necessary, only when they have no alternatives, no other reasonable options. We didn't make that standard up. That's a standard that is used by a number of departments throughout the country. San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, other places. It's a use of force standard that the Obama Justice Department basically put in place when they intervened in problematic agencies, including all of the aforementioned agencies. And in those places where those departments that have adopted that standard, it's worked to reduce uses of force. Seattle saw a 60% decrease in deadly and serious, mid-level and serious uses of force.
If I could step in here for just a moment, the current standard really is based on Graham versus Connor, right? The United States Supreme Court case in the late 1980s that said if an officer perceives that he or someone else, might be killed, faces a deadly threat or serious bodily injury, that they are authorized to use deadly force. And the measure is if an officer who is similarly trained, an officer who is in similar situation with same background, same training, if you could reasonably say, okay, another officer would see this as, a deadly threat. And I think the key has always been, it doesn't actually have to be a threat. It could be somebody with a cell phone, but if an officer genuinely believes, I've been in this situation before down a dark alley, and I've seen guys pull guns on me, and this looked like a gun, and I thought I was going to get killed, he's authorized or she's authorized to use force under the current standard. So the new standard, as I understand it, would require or would allow prosecutors in evaluating whether or not that officer acted legally, whether or not that officer could be charged criminally for shooting, you could examine that officer's behavior that led up to that, him running down that alley. Did he put himself in a position where he may have been in danger? Was there a level of negligence in his behavior that led up to that? And did he take any other, and really all other potentially de-escalation actions before he fired the gun?
Yeah, that's right. It's whether a reasonable officer in the same situation would have thought that there were other reasonable alternatives to the use of deadly force, which is not part of the law now. I mean, it's basically a simple rule of officers shouldn't shoot people unless they have to, which is, I think, what most people think the law is. I think it's actually what most officers do and what many departments try to train to.
The question I'm still slightly unclear on, and I'm going to reveal my ignorance as a reporter, and I should know this, but does it allow for the situation where an officer, for perception shootings, where an officer, where an officer perceives that there's a deadly threat?
Yes, absolutely. The bill is very clear that it's based on the facts known to the officer at the time. So if the officer sees somebody with a gun and the person points the gun at the officer and the officer fires, but then it's later discovered that the gun was unloaded. That's the fact that the gun was unloaded. That's not a fact known to the officer. That's not part of the calculus on which the decision is made.
There is no piece of legislation that has raised concerns among police officers in a greater manner than this piece of legislation. I think that's safe to say, Ron. And I
just have to say one thing, though, too, in the defense of law enforcement. In those states, in those jurisdictions where they're using this kind of a standard, there's also been less assaults on law enforcement officers. It makes them safer also. And I think that's really the lesson of this whole panel in terms of transparency, is that with transparency, with better police practices, with clearer definitions of when you can use force and better training then, because you can't train to a bad standard and expect different results, then everybody will be safer.
In other words, people have a different interaction with police because they know there's this standard.
I think it's more than that. I think it's that when the interactions are different from both sides, when law enforcement has to de-escalate, when they have to learn how to communicate with people, when they have to use their emotional intelligence and not just their physical or armed intelligence, then it makes for a better interaction with the community as well.
Ron, what are rank and file officers' biggest concerns? Because on the face of it, it would seem reasonable that the necessary standard as opposed to the reasonable standard.
Well, the biggest concern is that who's going to determine what was necessary. You know, based on a split-second decision and somebody who's going to judge that situation. And I know they put in there and they said that 20/20 hindsight isn't going to apply, but it will, because somebody who's not in that exact situation is going to be determining what that officer saw for that very moment. And to give you guys an example of us being able to try and relay that to the public, when this bill was brought out and we were trying to inform people about the situation that law enforcement is in, and you can't understand that, ourselves and LAPD took a use of force trailer up to the state capitol and invited the legislators that were backing this bill to go into this force simulator so they could experience what law enforcement sees. Everybody who backed the bill to change it from reasonable to necessary refused to go in the simulator. Absolutely refused to go in.
One of the problems with the simulator is that there's no de-escalation option. You either shoot or you get shot. There's no way to talk the person down. There's no way to take cover. There's no way to look for other options. It's just a fake simulator.
That's incorrect. There are actually scenarios built in there that will react to the way that you perceive. And if it's a situation that's already programmed to where the person in the scenario, not the person participating in the scenario, but the scenario itself is already programmed to where they're going to try and take you out, you're expected to perceive that you're in a situation where you're either going to survive or die. So the fact of the matter is that people don't want to be put in that situation, but yet they want to judge law enforcement who are put in that situation more often than we care to be. And this whole talking to the community, absolutely, but a comment was made about if there's more dialogue and it makes it safer for assaults on peace officers. That's not the case. And the unfortunate part is the ones that aren't here to protect themselves and talk about the situation that they were put in are the officers that have been killed. I have a good friend in 2015 who was very tactically sound. He was killed by somebody up in Lancaster who had his back to him. And in my heart and everything I know about this deputy was killed because this subject had his back to him. He shot him by drawing from his waist and shooting him without even looking. Lucky shot, yes, but the fact of the matter is, in my mind, I believe that my friend didn't want to shoot him in the back. And so you can talk about all these situations where people don't, get shot in the back and all that, but unless you're there, nobody really knows. But I know one thing, that this guy admitted later on to seeing the opportunity and taking it.
This is a great point to sort of end on because, for decades, law enforcement, rank and file as well as leaders, have said, the only people that can judge us are our own. You don't know what it's like to be a police officer. You don't know what it's like to be on the streets. Only we can really judge ourselves about whether or not we've acted properly. And I think the sense in recent years is, certainly post-Ferguson, is that there's been some unhappiness with how law enforcement has behaved. And so the tide has turned to, actually, we want to see more. We want to be able to judge more. The response that, hey, and with all due respect for your friend who you lost, we want to participate more in evaluating how police departments behave. And I think that's fundamentally what we're going through here, is it not? that the public in general has said, you know, for too long, you have asked us to police ourselves because only we can, because it's such a difficult job, and it is. But I think that era is over.
Yeah, could I add though, instead of leaving the AB 392 out there, it's important to note that Coalition of Peace Officers Associations created an additional bill, SB 230, and that was us offering, basically saying, you guys want to see something in particular, you want to see some particular actions from law enforcement, we're asking for all the training that we have, we can get from California to train us up to the point where, at the end of the day, if we have all the training that we need and are required to have to put us to make the best decision, that you're ultimately, if you're looking for accountability will come. If somebody does something totally counter to what they've been trained to do, the accountability is going to be there. But to just simply say, you know, we've got this bill that's going to hold you accountable, you know, that's a bill. We're offering a plan. We're offering a plan for the future. And, you know, the good thing about it is I think we're having dialogue now to where I think we're going to hopefully get to where we need to be.
That's what happens at KPCC. I would be remiss if we didn't allow the ranking member of the panel to say a few words in the end. Under Sheriff Murakami, do you have an opinion on that bill? A, and you know, I guess you're going to bow out of the Brady discussion. It sounds like this sheriff is not going to jump into it. But what is your opinion on this bill? As I understand it, law enforcement leaders as well oppose it.
Well,
the change in the use of force.
Yeah, there's some concerns about when you mention like tactics playing into it. Those are things that we assess when we evaluate shootings. It won't equate to a prosecution, but it does equate to violations of policy. But a lot of what has to do with shootings is a personal decision. You know, I started my career in East LA back in the early 80s, and there were a couple of times I could actually shot somebody, and I chose not to. To where one instance, the guy armed with a handgun kept telling him to drop the weapon. The hammer was actually coming back. I'm getting ready to shoot him. By God's grace, he dropped it, and I was able to pull back. But on the same token, I exposed myself to the possibility of him raising up and shooting me. And that's what it is, too. When it comes to the decision to shoot or not shoot, to me it's personal. How far am I willing to risk myself to avoid shooting somebody? I chose to take it to the extreme to where I was willing to shoot him, but I did everything I could to avoid it. Had I shot him, would it have been legally justifiable? Yes, it would have been. But in my mindset, I chose not to. So a lot of what we're talking about, I said it's a matter of how far is that individual officer willing to put himself at risk. You know, it's basically it's a hot situation, and like you know, like Ron said, you know, you have milliseconds to make the decision. And for me personally, for me to shoot somebody, I'd have to be in total peace that it was the right thing to do, and I had no other choice. But to me, that's a personal decision.
Okay, it's after 9. I think we should wrap it up. Is that right? According to the producer. And stick around. Our panel will be here if you want to pigeonhole them at the end. Thanks again to ACLU Director of Police Practices, Peter Biebring, the President of the Association of Los Angeles County Deputy Sheriffs, Ron Hernandez, member of the Youth Justice Coalition, Kim McGill, the Undersheriff of Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Tim Murakami, and the Constitutional Policing Advisor for the Los Angeles Police Department, Arif Alikhan. Thank you all for being with us.